Having considered the options that a lender has for trying to dissuade or reduce the impact of a default, I think it's probably worthwhile for us to talk about what happens when an organization or an individual does in fact fail to meet their obligations. In general, the most common recourse that lenders have is to either seize collateral or to restrict future borrowing. There are, at least in the modern world, not a lot of opportunities to force creditors to come and work your fields for you should they fail to repay a loan. But in general, what we try to do is make sure that information about defaulting borrowers is widely available. While defaulting borrowers may not be extensively punished as they have been in the past, records are kept by lenders and shared between lenders in order to be able to prevent an errant borrower from abusing information asymmetries, which basically means borrowing from someone, ripping them off, and then finding someone who doesn't know you're a bad borrower and ripping them off too in sequence. So the first kinds of consumer credit ratings that we see begin to appear in 1956 with an agency that was offered to rate individuals based on a number of different demographic traits for corporations so that they would have a better idea about who was a good or bad credit risk to lend to. Within 20 years, by the 1970s, we actually see a number of laws being passed. It took less than 15 years for the first Consumer Protection Acts to be passed in this regard to restrict what kinds of information these credit rating agencies could use to assess your creditworthiness. In particular, they were not allowed to use certain things related to ethnicity or religion or country of origin to establish your credit risk. A lot of this was done to prevent what we would later refer to as redlining, where people were assessed on their risk not based entirely on their individual traits, but based on, in many cases, traits that they were not free to choose. And so a lot of modern credit rating systems are constrained to this day by these kinds of regulations, which has led, of course, to modern lenders trying to come up with all kinds of different non-protected credit metrics that they can use for assessing the risk of a loan. Now, ratings are not just assigned to individuals. As you're probably aware, bond ratings or debt creditor ratings are assigned both to sovereigns and to corporations who borrow as well. Now, each country takes a different approach to its bankruptcy laws. Some are more permissive than others. America, for instance, is notoriously permissive in relation to bankruptcy. And these types of countries tend to make it easier for debtors to try to reestablish themselves and try once again, which predictably has a very strong impact on entrepreneurship as a career path. If we were to contrast America to another well-developed country like Germany, what we find is that the social culture in Germany is very much leaning against entrepreneurship. In America, the view seems to be that if you try and fail, you should simply try again. The notion in Germany is more of, you tried, you failed, why did you bother trying? Which is really just a matter of ingrained social attitudes, which of course do change over time. But nonetheless, the social approach to bankruptcy and the views that people have related to the morality of borrowing, lending, and defaulting has a very big macroeconomic impact. In fact, lax bankruptcy laws in some areas has actually led to the rather unusual phenomenon of bankruptcy tourism, of people moving to permissive regions internationally in order to declare bankruptcy in those areas so that they can more readily protect their assets. Now, in some cases, the lenders may have the legal means to impose on a debtor, right? They may be sufficiently strong or in a legal position where they can simply claim assets. But in some cases, they may prefer to restructure a set of obligations and cut some sort of deal that allows them to retain some value. In some cases, this is simply because creditors might not sit particularly high on the order of priority in which they'll be paid. And so in the event that they were to force a liquidation of a corporate lender, they might not in fact earn anything at all because the claims which precede them might eat up all of the value of the assets. So in many cases, it can be advantageous to attempt to restructure the debts of different kinds of borrowers. Now, this requires very particular circumstances, and while in others, we actually see that we may not be able to impose our will on errant creditors or errant borrowers, for instance, as in the case of Argentina in 2001. A number of international organizations and Financial institutions had lent money to the government of Argentina, who, after a debilitating economic crisis, found themselves in a position of having to default on a variety of their debt obligations. Now, some organizations like hedge funds had purchased up some of this Argentine debt and held out against the idea of restructuring it for as long as absolutely possible, going so far as to try to seize Argentine government assets held in other legal jurisdictions. The end of that story is that, of course, the hedge funds did get paid out in full quietly on the side, but it delayed Argentina's ability to engage in this debt restructuring for some time. Nonetheless, there is a good link to the story of a hedge fund seizing an Argentine warship in Ghana, which might be interesting for you to explore if you wanted to get some idea about what kinds of consequences can emerge when you're dealing with powerful borrowers who have defaulted on their loans. Now, usually restructuring involves at least one of the following. Writing down the face value of the debt. In other words, you owe me $8 instead of 12. Reducing an interest rate, say cutting the rate from 7% down to 5%, or even extending the due date. You don't owe me this money on this Friday, you owe me the money next Friday instead when you get paid. Mathematically, all of these effectively reduce the present value of the lender's claims, however, which is basically the same thing as writing down the overall value of what I expect to receive. If I get my money late, that creates a cost for me. If I collect less interest, that creates a cost for me. If I collect less principal, that creates a cost for me. To see an example of these kinds of restructuring, take a look at what happened with Greek government debt over the prior 10 years. In general, it involved a mixture of extending maturities and rate reductions, but write-downs of the principals were very, very strongly rejected by the lenders. And so Greece largely has restructured its debt on the basis of longer maturities and lower interest rates. Now in Canada, the creditors and companies are able to restructure voluntarily under what's called the Canada Business Corporations Act. Or if they're unable to reach some kind of out-of-court workout, they can bring in the law to settle the matter between the two using what's called the CCAA, or the Canada Creditors, pardon me, the CCAA, which gives us the Canadian equivalents of Chapter 7 and Chapter 11 bankruptcy. In general, companies that have more than $5 million worth of liabilities can seek court-ordered restructuring. Those with less than $5 million worth of liabilities are forced into liquidation. Now, of course, this is a fairly sophisticated technique in terms of debt restructuring. And in not all cases is debt restructuring going to be sufficient. And in some cases, debt restructuring might even be impossible. So in those sorts of cases, what we typically do is write off the debts as being uncollectible. In that sense, we are effectively looking at forgiving the loans of certain individuals in order to make sure that our society doesn't necessarily fray at the seams. The first sort of mass write-off of debts that we see in history, what was referred to as amargi in Sumerian, which you can see written in cuneiform at the top of this slide, may have occurred under King Entemena of Lagash. King Entemena, I get the same Entemena from the Entemena Cone in the Goatsman text, lived approximately 44 centuries ago and ordered, as translated from the original Sumerian, a remission of the obligations of Lagash. He returned the mother to the child and returned the child to the mother, and a remission of interest-bearing barley loans he instituted. So this may be perhaps the earliest recorded large-scale debt forgiveness that we see in history, but we used to believe that the first had come under one of the later successors of Entemena, Urukagina. We also see these kinds of mass debt forgivenesses occurring in a number of different places around the Middle East over the next 40 years. These sorts of economic freedom acts occur roughly every generation. In some cases, they occur as frequently as every 5 to 10 years in certain regions. Nonetheless, the amargi, the Sumerian symbols that we see here on the slide, poetically refer to a return to the mother, but more appropriately can be understood as a return to the state of nature, in which debts don't force people into slavery. Now, you'll notice, of course, that these are, of course, agrarian debts which have been forgiven, not commercial debts. So this really applies to farmers who've fallen on hard times, people who weren't able to meet their tax obligations or able to meet their loan obligations as a result of forces which may have been beyond their control. One of the reasons that researchers feel these kind of economic freedom um, actions may have been taken was due to a similar problem which emerges in the Roman civilization many centuries later with the Spartan-led slave revolt. If you get to a point where too many people in your society have become enslaved due to their debts to everyone else, you have a serious problem with social stability. It's not long after, say, 80 or 90% of the people in your civilization are slaves to the remaining 10 or 20%, that you'll begin to see violent uprisings. So perhaps unsurprisingly, the kings of Sumerian city-states tended to lean towards forgiving debts and resetting this sort of agrarian debt clock every few years. Now, it's worth noting that the concept of debt forgiveness did not disappear at the end of the Bronze Age. In fact, a recent example of large-scale debt forgiveness occurred in 2005, when the International Monetary Fund, International Development Bank, and the African Development Bank all provided a massive debt relief to the most indebted countries in the world, what was called the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative. The claims on these countries by those lenders were completely extinguished over the last few years. And if you take a look at the link down here on the IMF site, it'll provide you with a little bit more explanation of what was required of these countries and how long it took them to accomplish their reforms in order to have their debts written off. Nonetheless, it is important to recognize that the social stability of our civilization may rely in some cases on violating these kinds of laws about debt slavery and creating an opportunity for people to escape from misfortunes which may not have befallen them as a result of any kind of moral failing or any kind of personal errors. And this debt forgiveness window creates a lot of opportunity for people to begin to remake their lives.